You're listening to EduVoices, Champion Foster Futures, a podcast amplifying the voices of those transforming education for children in foster care. Each episode brings you real stories, research, and advocacy efforts to improve the lives of foster youth. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Now, let's dive in. Today we welcome Dr. Rudy Reyes, CEO of Children's Home of Lubbock. Dr. Reyes has dedicated his career to serving children and families through leadership in child welfare, prevention services, and community partnerships that support foster youth across Texas.
Dr. Reyes, thank you for joining us. To begin, tell us about your professional journey and what led you to become the CEO of Children's Home of Lubbock. What continues to inspire your work serving children and families?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great honor and a privilege to be representing the Children's Home of Lubbock. And I guess before I would be able to tell you about my professional journey, it's a little bit about my personal journey. So my parents dove into ministry when I was 8 years old. My father was an alcoholic, and he found freedom through Christ. And that really changed his life. So he got connected with his church and dove into administrative rehabilitation. And my mom went along for that journey as well. And so from the time I was 8 to 18, my parents dedicated their lives to really family preservation, which was, not even a word back then, but it was something that they were very passionate about. And so by living that example for me and me living it alongside with them, we continued to sacrifice a lot of things in our family. And they showed me that world of sacrificing yourself for the betterment of others. And so it was one of those things that kind of naturally progressed into the career path that I chose. My parents knew that I had a passion for animals, and they gave me Ranger Rick magazines and zoology magazines. I really thought I was going to be a veterinarian, y'all. But veterinary school was not in my future. I sat with my mom and she asked me what I wanted to do. I told her vet, and she said, well, you're not going to take a dog to heaven with you, so I would rather see you invest in people. And it was kind of a aha moment. I'm 50 years old in a couple of weeks, so I can stop calling my mom a dream crusher. But in that moment, I thought, man, that was pretty harsh. But I realized that I did really need to start thinking about how I was going to impact the world. And so that journey took me into education, investing in kids. Spent about 24 years in public education. And while I was doing that, I got recruited to serve on the board for the Children's Home of Lubbock. Served there for 4 years, really fell in love with the mission and the ministry and the work that they were doing. And then just about a year and a half ago, the position for CEO came up. And when God put that in front of me, I realized this is exactly where I need to be right now. And so I'm happy to be there. And I think my inspiration really just comes from the fact that at the children's home, specifically, the work that we're doing is unique because there are a lot of organizations that take care of kids in a variety of different ways, and they're doing a great job. But I think what makes us unique is that we're working to heal the whole child. We are going to address them emotionally, physically, mentally, relationally, and spiritually.
Yeah, thanks for getting us started today. The child welfare system has increasingly emphasized prevention and strengthening families before removal becomes necessary. From your perspective, what does effective prevention look like, and where do you see the greatest opportunities for improvement?
Well, for me, I think I really have to take it back to my roots. And as a believer in Christ, I believe that the work that we're doing is basically spiritual warfare. These kids come from a lot of trauma. They come from a lot of hurt. And I tell people all the time, the work we do at the children's home, unfortunately, it's a response to evil in the world. There are a lot of hurt kids who come from hurt families. And for no fault of their own, they have been victimized. And at this point, I really believe that what we're looking at is casualties of a spiritual war. And so for me, prevention looks like having families rooted in Christ. Prevention for me looks like having the family unit strengthened. And if I could see these families strengthened in their local church, there is research that says that a youth that's raised in local church is less likely to participate in at-risk behaviors. They have more relationships. they know that they have greater resilience, and the research is pretty clear about that. And so for me, prevention starts at home. We certainly don't want to see families split apart. Every case that we have at the children's home, we serve about 100 kids a month for a variety of reasons, but every case is a CPS case. And that's not a success story. It's really sad. We would rather not know that kids have to be taken from their homes because of neglect or abuse. And so for me, the prevention starts being faithful. And I would really like to see the families who are struggling to keep their home together, to keep their kids with them, and keep them out of the system. I would encourage them to get connected to their local church. And then I would encourage the local church, really connect with these families and see what you can do to help them. There's a lot of research that shows that a spiritual life of any kind of faith really goes a long way for youth at risk.
So how do kids get to the children's home? Some go straight into foster care, right? And some don't. What's the difference?
So because every case that we have is a CPS case, they've already been removed. And so we don't take private placements. There was a time when it was referred to as an orphanage. And that was back in the day. It's really not a word that you hear a lot anymore in this business. But we're not taking kids who are being dropped off by parents. These are state cases that have been investigated. They have a CPS caseworker. They have a case manager. They're probably in the middle of an investigation somewhere. Some kids stay with us for a couple of weeks while things get sorted out. Some will stay a couple of months. Our average stay is about 2 years. We are really trying not to make a lifer out of this. We don't want to raise other people's kids. That's really not the goal. Family restoration, family preservation, that's the ultimate goal. And if we can restore that relationship with their parents and be a part of that story, we certainly will. So we have a full-time counseling center and counselors and therapists who work with families as well. But if a safe reunification is just not possible, then we offer foster care in town and on our campus. So we have a residential facility with about 8 to 9 cottages working full time. And then, of course, if the kid is removed for a permanent removal from their parental rights, then we're looking for more permanency. And so we offer adoption services as well.
Wow, okay. So education is often one of the few consistent experiences in a child's life. What factors have you found to be the most important in helping children involved in the child welfare system succeed academically?
Well, I love this question. I think probably because I'm coming right off of a 23, 24-year span in education, and I've seen a lot of wonderful educators who are really pouring themselves into kids. But I've spent about 30 years working with kids, whether I was a mentor to youth, a camp counselor. At one point, I was a youth minister. I've been a classroom teacher, a school administrator. So I can tell you from my own experiences that successful kids really need 4 basic things, and that's predictability, consistency, high expectations, and relationships. Those are the 4 components that really make a successful child, not just academically, but in life. That predictability really creates security for them. And when you're coming from a chaotic world that's full of trauma, maybe you don't know where you're going to sleep that night. You don't know what you're going to eat the next day. You don't know if somebody's coming home to take care of you or not. You don't know if you have clean clothes, any clothes at all. Predictability becomes a blanket. And I think schools can do that. Educators do that all the time. They create routines that kids can rely on. And fewer things they have to guess at, the more secure they feel. And that's something that education does naturally. And good teachers know to do that from the start. Consistency, that consistency where you just show up and be that consistent adult, be that consistent voice, be the consistent champion. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's what the Bible tells us, right? Well, there's some truth to that because that consistency creates trust. And the kids who are, again, walking through this foster system and being put into a situation where they cannot trust adults at this point. They may not even be able to trust themselves. Having consistency, again, it's a safety net. something that they can count on. And that comes in the form of consequences as well. I mean, it's not just all rainbows and butterflies. Sometimes a kid in care, a kid going through the foster system, they need consistent boundaries. They need consistent expectations and consequences. It just means that if you set it as an adult, you're going to come through. And sometimes they'll push those boundaries just because they really need to know, is what you're saying true? Can I count on you? Are you a person of your word? And maybe they don't have the words to put all that together, but that's truly what they're doing. And so predictability, consistency, and then high expectations. That's my third one. I always tell people the kids need high expectations. Expect more of them. A lot of times as educators, we have a heart of gold. I have teachers who they have bleeding hearts, but they know that if they lower that bar, they're really setting that child up for failure. And so those quality educators that are out there, they're raising the bar every day for those kids and say, I believe in you. And what that's really doing for them is setting the high expectations for them is giving that child hope. And this high expectation creates hope because it tells the kid, I see something in you that you may not see in yourself. I know you can do this hard thing. I know you're capable of stepping up to this challenge. And so again, predictability, consistency, high expectations, and at the root of it all, it's relationships. And that's what these kids need. So anybody who's working with kids in the foster care system, I would encourage you, try to build that relationship. It starts with a relationship. Get to know them, get to know their background. It doesn't mean that you pry. It just means that you're available and that you are consistently there for them and that you're somebody they can see and count on every day. But that relationship really creates belonging. And for so many of that's what's missing. They don't really feel like they belong anywhere because they've been let down by their biological families. Maybe they feel mistrust in the system. They don't really appreciate the fact that they're in a foster home. And so sometimes they do feel, like they're floating, that nobody wants them. I got a kid right now in our care, and I remember him by his numbers, 3, 6, 11, and 12. He's had 3 failed adoptions. He was taken into care when he was 6 years old. He's only 11, and this is his 12th placement. And so when you think about those numbers and how they impact this child, then it's no wonder he has trust issues, and he's pressing boundaries, and he's trying to work the system because nothing's stable in his life. And so again, I would say that if anybody wants to help kids be successful, not just academically, I would say provide those things: predictability, consistency, high expectations, and invest in the relationship.
You talked about setting high expectations and building relationships. Can you elaborate on what schools are doing very well supporting children in foster care, and what do you believe that there's still room for growth when it comes to schools?
Yeah, so I spoke of my kid, 3, 6, 11, 12. That trauma, it teaches you not to trust. And when children can't trust, they can't feel safe. And so our greatest challenge and the greatest privilege is to walk alongside them and help them believe that adults can be safe again. And that's a hard ask, but I believe that schools do really well and work toward that every single day. I've worked with a number of educators who are fantastically showing up every day. Just being present, being consistent in their lives makes all the difference. For many kids in crisis, school's a safe haven. And for many times, foster kids have experienced multiple placements, and they're far from home. They're far from anything that looks familiar. But I believe schools, especially public schools, they have a special rhythm. They have a heartbeat, and it's familiar to that kid. And so a lot of times when kids are being, put in different placements, their environment may change, but somehow they end up in a public school and they feel normal again. They're part of a classroom. They have a routine. There's, English, math, science. There's a lab. There's recess. There's a lunchroom. There's a nurse they can go to. They don't have to guess where there's breakfast and if there's lunch. So there's some predictability that public schools provide them. Just being a good, strong system. And then there's some of that already embedded in the relationships that they build. And so the consistency of a caring adult in the school system who shows up for them day after day and month after month, it really goes a long way toward that healing process. And I believe that cannot be understated, just being present for them.
You talked a while ago about some kids being there maybe for a week or month or even longer, long-term, year possibly, or longer than that.
Yeah.
So do they typically stay at the same school when you're talking about having this rhythm, or are they changing schools as well?
Right. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times they end up changing schools because when you're looking at a different placement, you're looking at a different family. And so that family may not be going to the same school, may not go to the same district, may not even be in the same town. So I can guarantee you that 3, 6, 11, 12, like I know that kid has seen different schools every time. And I think that's kind of why I'm giving so much praise to the public school system as a setup, because there is familiarity regardless of where you land. There are some things that stay consistent in most public schools. And I think that lends itself to that familiarity and that safety that the kid needs to feel quickly, because everything else seems so different. So it's maybe the one place that they feel like, okay, I know what's going on here. I know how to survive. I know how to acclimate here. This makes sense to me. And so those pieces of consistency really help out. But I think, again, just being that consistent adult when they do arrive and showing up for them, that's really great. I think one of the things you asked was, where's there room for growth? Was that one of the questions?
Yes.
Yeah. As far as growth, again, the public school system does such a great job of showing up for kids. But I think what's happened right now is there's room for growth, not because there's not a lack of professionals who care. I think it's because our educators who do right now, they're just carrying an extraordinary burden. There is a widespread shortage of teachers and counselors, educators in general, and we see that day after day in the news and our social media feed. People are leaving the profession and not enough people are joining the profession. And I think that what that means for our kids is that the very adults that we're depending on for that consistency and to stand in the gap with them, they're being stretched thinner than they ever have before. And so for most students, I think changing teachers can be an inconvenience. But for a child who's already experienced these kind of multiple placements and disappointments and repeated loss and broken relationships, losing another adult in their life, it just feels like another confirmation that people don't stick around. And it's another disappointment. So I would love for us to find a way to support educators to keep them in the profession longer, because they're doing a lot of hard work. And the more teachers we lose, the harder it is for those kids in care to feel that consistent love and appreciation and wanted, being wanted by an adult. So I believe we have to support the adults. And I guess maybe that's the long and short of it. But if there's room for improvement, I would say we need to support the adults who are supporting our children. When we invest in teachers, counselors, and school staff, we're also investing in the healing journey of the child.
And that really leads nicely into the next question that we had. So every Texas school district designates a foster care liaison. In your opinion, what distinguishes highly effective liaisons, and what partnerships should they prioritize to best support the students?
Well, first of all, I would want to recognize that the foster care liaisons, they're working hard. I want to recognize the incredible work that they're already doing, because in many districts, that role falls to the school counselor. And the school counselor, if you are not familiar with the school system, you may not understand how much the school counselor really has on their plate. And so in a lot of campuses, it falls to the school counselor, and they're already in charge of crisis counseling, suicide assessments, 504 plans, classroom scheduling, testing coordination, SSTs, parent conferences, graduation plans, behavior interventions. And then now we're asking them, okay, you're in charge of coordinating the care of our foster children and the foster care support system in general. You're the guy, you're the gal. That's a lot to ask of them. And so first I would say they're doing a great job. They're working as hard as they possibly can. So maybe the question isn't much about effectiveness as much as it is support, because we need to work as a system to support them. And so that's what I would say is that work to support them.
Okay. And going a little more in depth, so how can schools strengthen that communication and collaboration with people like CASA volunteers, SSCC case managers, caregivers, and other members of the child support team?
Okay. Well, I think that, that's a great leeway into how can we support them? Because there are a lot of systems already in place, and you mentioned a whole bunch of them. And the CASA volunteers, the case managers, the caregivers, the child support team is already there. Really, I think the main job of the foster care liaison would be and should be to bring people together so that that child doesn't fall through the cracks. And I think that could really be the mark of a successful foster care liaison. It's not a person who has all the answers. The most effective foster care liaison isn't going to have all the answers because every child is unique, but they're the person who ensures no child ever falls through the cracks. And it's going to require them to bring people together with their different areas of expertise and their different passions and their different resources and say, how can we meet the need of this little guy? How can we meet the need of this teenager? Emotionally, physically, academically, what do we need to do? And so there's a lot of great systems that are already in place. And I think one of the things that I would encourage them to do is really take advantage of the SST process. There's a lot of power in a good SST. And if you're not familiar with an SST, for those who are listening and may not be familiar, it's really just a student support team. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a team of people who want to support the student. It's really nothing special. You don't have to be identified in special ed. You don't have to have a 504. You don't have to really have any other qualifications except, hey, this guy needs a little extra. And if that counselor could call an SST, even a parent, caregiver could, request an SST, then it brings people to the table. And I think that's really what we're looking for, is to bring people to the table and make sure that every opportunity possible is presented for that support for the child. And invite the parent, invite the caregiver, and invite the child if it's appropriate. Because what an amazing visual that would be for that child to walk into a room and realize they're not in trouble. This is actually a room of champions. And every single person around this table is here because they love me, they care about me, they want the best for me, they all see potential in me, and they're about to have a conversation. How can we get his grades up? How can we make sure he comes to school on time? How can we make sure he, gets the instrument needed for the band he'd like to join? I mean, there's a lot of different pieces to the puzzle, and it cannot rely on just the liaison to fill in those gaps. And so I would say bringing people to the table. And then the second thing I would say for, a successful foster care liaison is start a dashboard. I think as an administrator, I found a lot of power in that. And that would just be my 2 cents to kind of help them stay abreast of things, because there's a lot going on and there's so many community resources available for, clothes, for food, for transportation, scholarships, mentor programs, summer camps, workforce solutions, vocational opportunities. There's a lot out there that these foster care students are going to be needing and looking for. And sometimes they may not even know that they need it. But as a foster care liaison, especially if you're new to the role, start a dashboard. And if somebody has one already, steal it. Educators love to do that stuff, right? Don't reinvent the wheel every year. So keep handy dandy notebook or Word document or a spreadsheet that really list all of your local community resources, the local phone numbers, the contacts of people who are going to be able to help your kid. Because at the end of the day, you are not going to be able to shoulder it all by yourself. You have to be able to outsource the needs of this child so that they're all met. It's a lot. And so again, I go back to, we just need to work to support the work that they're doing.
Yeah, so this liaison person, you said often is the school counselor, which I agree on that. And with schools in Texas in general, a lot of unfunded mandates and a lot of this goes on these people like counselors to take on these roles. Yeah. And
on top of everything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And being understaffed. But so is the outside organizations. They're understaffed too.
Yeah.
CASA is always seeking volunteers to come in. The local social workers are always overwhelmed, have a large caseload. And so where do you see this successful collaboration? Is there any stories or testimonies you could tell what this successful collaboration looks like amongst all these groups and what challenges exist?
Wow. So it reminds me of a couple of kids I had when I was at the high school. So I was an associate principal at a local high school, and we had two kids, I believe they were twins. I know they were brother, sister, but yeah, I'm almost certain they were twins because they turned 18 within their senior year or right before their senior year. And according to the foster care system, they're kind of out of the system. And so they no longer wanted to stay with their foster parents. They decided, we're 18. We don't like being in care. I guess they weren't really happy with their last placement. And they decided to go live on their own. Truly, what 18-year-old is ready to live on their own? In my experience, not very many, especially a kid in care. But they were determined. And so this brother-sister duo moved in with some other friends who decided that they also want to live on their own. So we ended up with 4 of our students at this high school who had all decided on their own that we're going to get a house. Somebody had mercy on them and said, you know what? I have a house. I will let y'all live there just so you stay off the street. And so they had a local house, but that's all they had. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have a refrigerator. They didn't have beds. They didn't have transportation to school. So they had a lot of needs, and we loved those kids, and we saw that they were really trying. I think what they really wanted to do was stand on their own 2 feet and just be adults. They've been looking forward to getting out of the system for so long. They wanted to graduate. They weren't trying to drop out of school. They weren't involved in gangs. They weren't trying to, sell drugs. They were trying to do things right. They wanted to just graduate high school, be a success. But we really needed to pull in all the resources. And this collaboration had to happen in order to make them successful. And so our principal at the time started just knocking on the doors of every organization that could, like who's got furniture, who's got food, who's got bus passes, who can turn on their electricity, where can they get a job? Because these kids are going to need all those things. And so as a whole, the school somehow becomes a hub. And I'm grateful for that. I think in a lot of communities, they don't recognize how vital that hub really is to them. But my principal at the time really took the reins and led that discussion, say, how can we provide for these kids? And so it was a success story. We were able to, keep those kids motivated and fed and bathed. I mean, there was times they would come and they're like, hey, we don't have any water. I'm like, what happened to the water? It got turned off. When did it get turned off? 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, 2 weeks ago? Why didn't you tell us sooner? We can work on this. And so they were really trying, but it was a year-long process because all they really wanted to do was just stand on their own 2 feet and graduate and keep their head above water. And it took a lot of support. And so we had all the systems. Again, we are so blessed. We live in a country with so many resources, and I would agree, they're always short. We're short funded, we're short-handed, but still blessed beyond measure. And we are blessed to be a blessing. And so we work together to help these kids, and that collaboration turned out to be a success story. Those kids graduated, and thank God, because I think the opposite could have been true, and they could have ended up dropped out and homeless. And so it is through these successful collaborations that we're able to help these kids.
If you're finding value in today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe to EduVoices, championing foster futures on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribing ensures you never miss an episode packed with powerful stories, expert insights, and actionable strategies for supporting children in foster care. Plus, it helps us continue growing this community of educators, advocates, and changemakers. Now let's get back to the conversation. Many supports occur outside school hours. So what academic, behavioral, social, emotional, and enrichment services are provided after school? And how can educators better understand and connect with those supports?
Yeah. Those supports are many. And again, because they're so needed, I think one of the things that educators already do is recognize a child in need. And so those outside of school hours, it's a real challenge, I think, for foster parents. They're juggling a lot on top of just homework. A lot of times they're dealing with kids who have suffered through trauma. So their bedtime routine may be a nightmare. And asking them to read 30 minutes every night and sign the reading log, it just may not happen. And sometimes I think we just need a little bit of grace. But I think it starts with really knowing who your kids are and where they're from and what they're doing. So there are a lot of resources out there. I would encourage the educators really just to connect to the ones that already exist. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's homework help probably within your district. Invite them to the tutorials you already have. There's no need to, show up extra early or stay extra late. I think if you just invite them to a lunch and learn, if somehow this foster care and this foster parent cannot get their kid there early because they got multiple drop-offs. They got a kid in high school, kid in middle school, kid in elementary. So getting all of them, before 7:30 is a task. Then maybe if you're willing, do a lunch and learn. Maybe offering tutoring there, homework help. Maybe just really being cognitive of the homework that you're asking of these foster kids and the foster parents, understanding that they do have, we have high expectations, but we also have realistic lens that these kids and these parents have challenges. But a lot of these things that are taken for granted, like sports, summer programs, field trips, those are things that could easily become challenging for kids in care and the foster parents that support them, and the caregivers. And so I would say as educators, just be a little mindful. I think it really just starts not because they don't care. I think sometimes it just starts with knowing. Just know who your kids are. And if you're in doubt, find out who your foster care liaison is and ask for the list. Just like, are there any kids in foster care on my roster? Because I think at first you need to work to know, seek to understand first, and then help make a plan for success afterwards. Because the content's going to take care of itself, but that relationship has to be built first. And you really can't build that relationship until you know who's in front of you. And so that's where I would say that they could really help out there.
Let's take a little deeper dive into the questions here and get into trauma-informed practices. From your perspective, what does healing look like for children who have experienced adversity?
Healing should look like peace. And I think that's really hard for most people to come by, but especially a kid who's coming through trauma and has experienced that. It's hard to be at rest. When your nervous system is amped up and your mind doesn't stop running, it comes from that danger. We're in that fight or flight, and they're constantly fighting for survival, for safety, to be seen, to be fed, just to be safe. And so I think healing begins the moment a child believes they're actually safe. And that could take a while. It really could. And now it's hard because they experience so much trauma that asking them to feel safe just seems like an impossibility. But it's just, you just got to chip away. You just got to pour into them little by little and continue to be present and consistent and work to gain that trust, because trust takes time. I have a staff member that I work with, and she herself was a child in care, and she was raised in the foster system. She had a very abusive father, and her siblings went through the system. She got adopted, was raised by a loving family. And so for the majority of her childhood, she had a stable home. But the beginning of her childhood was so traumatic that these reoccurring nightmares were a reality in her life. She would wake up literally in fear because the nightmare was that her dad was chasing her in a parking lot and taking her back. That was basically the gist of the nightmare. And it just happened over and over and over again, well into her teenage years, well into her adult years. And then she got married. And she told me, I met my husband. God brought me a great man. And it wasn't until we got married on our very first night together that I slept and I didn't have that dream anymore. I just felt safe. I just felt at peace. And then she goes, I don't know if it was because I had my husband and I knew that my dad could no longer get me. Even though I knew that, my body didn't know that. My mind didn't know that. And so psychologically, she was always running. And she tells that story. And, she's a middle-aged woman at this point, in her 50s. And she tells that story like it happened yesterday because those dreams were so real to her. And so, if the question is, what does a healing look like? It looks like peace. And that's a lot for us to ask of kids, to be at peace, to feel safe. There's just not a switch you turn on and off. It takes trust, consistency, accountability, a lot of grace. And I can't say it enough. It takes relationship. You're going to have a healthy relationship with that child before they can even begin to think of that. And so I think the school system, we're talking about educators and education. I think the school system does a great job of that already. They try to create that safe space. And again, because they're there day after day. But one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that even though classroom teachers play a large part in a healthy school system, the reality is the classroom teacher is really the year-long relationship. But it's the school secretary, it's the assistant principal, it's the PE coach, it might be the athletic trainer. Some of those support roles, they're the ones who are with that child and in that kid's life year after year after year. I'll take my daughter, for example. She may have a different math teacher every year, but she's going to have the same pom coach, 4 years in a row. My son, the same thing. He may have a different science teacher every year, but he was a trainer. He got connected. And so he stayed in that program. He had the same head trainer year after year. So those relationships that build upon each other, if there's an opportunity for that kind of consistency, those are relationships. So, while we're talking to educators and education, we don't want to shortchange the value that these non-classroom teachers and those roles really play in the healing process of our kids. Those counselors, and they're in the same boat. They may be that kid's counselor for the entire year, especially when you're looking at elementary school. If the kid's lucky enough to be there K through 5, then they've got 6 years of the same school counselor, the same school nurse, the same school secretary. Even though they got a different teacher every year, those other adults have been consistent. And so that is where healing begins, when they have that trust and that consistency. And so I think it goes a long way as educators just to build that relationship up year after year, day after day.
So children involved in the child welfare system can face increased vulnerability and exploitation, including human trafficking. From your perspective, what should educators, caregivers, and community members understand about recognizing risk, preventing exploitation, and creating protective environments for children?
That is so heavy.
Sure.
That is so heavy. Unfortunately, I think one of the things that people don't understand or really maybe fail to recognize is that it's happening in our own backyard. It is happening in your city. It's so scary. It just really is. I got to share the story. I'm a little hesitant to share it, but it just really drove it home for me that it is happening in your own backyard. But as an assistant principal, one of the things that I was, always had to be on top of at the high school was truancy. And so this story is as much a warning as it is anything. But truancy just means that your kid didn't show up for class. And first of all, I got to say, as an assistant principal, if the school calls you, parents, and tells you that your kid isn't in class, just believe them. It's true. Okay. Your kid was not in class because so many times we had to hear, from the other side, the other end of the phone was like, well, it's because they were in the bathroom. I'm like, no, they were not in the bathroom for 2 hours. I promise you that. Well, their stomach hurt. I'm like, no, please just believe me. Like they have gone missing. They are MIA. Well, and then, I called them and they said they weren't, or I've tracked their phone and their phone is there. I'm like, ma'am, they just left it in their locker. I don't know what to tell you. Like we're working to help inform you. I say that as part of the story because I had a kid who was truant all the time, would come to school every day and would go MIA for hours, the whole first half of the day, and show up for lunch. They always show up for lunch, by the way. But when they were gone, who knows where they were because they were not in school. And that's the warning. Because when you don't know where your kid is, when the school doesn't know where your kid is and the parent doesn't know where your kid is, there was somebody somewhere probably not reading their Bible, probably not volunteering at their local soup kitchen. They're doing something, nefarious, something that you probably don't want adults to know about. And that's what I always used to tell them. Like, if you're disappearing, it's because you don't want adults to know what you're doing. And so this one kid who I was always on top of about her truancy, she's always missing. One day she had gone missing from, I say missing, she had been truant for, few periods of the day. And the counselor was alerted because it was lunchtime. She had lunch duty and she looked out to her left out the window and saw this child being shoved out of a moving car naked and on the school grounds. And this sports car had pulled up, shoved her out the passenger side and zoomed off. And the counselor ran out there and put her jacket around her and brought her crying into the nurse's office. Where was she? Who was she with? Who was this person? And where had she been going time after time that she was gone for hours? And I'm convinced she was a victim of sex trafficking because when she was able to talk about it, she refused to cooperate. She would not tell any of the police officers who that person was or where they were. She wanted nothing to do with the investigation, and she was protecting her abuser, which is, trademark for sex trafficking and the victims. And that's happening. And I witnessed it at our school happening. And so I can tell you if it's happening in your backyard, you need to be aware. And so since we're talking education and educators, I would say truancy is a huge red flag because, you send your kid every day to school. Part of our job as educators is to educate them. And the other half is to help keep them safe. We want them to have an education, but we want to keep them safe. And part of keeping them safe is just knowing where they are. And so, be on the lookout for those red flags. Truancy is a huge red flag. And then as educators, be on the lookout for some of those red flags because, again, it takes our relationship and knowing what's going on with them. So look for who eats alone all the time because, trafficking isn't it kidnapping? I watched a movie last night on Netflix and my wife said, this is the same plot as Taken. I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. They kidnap somebody and there's an international guy from Armenia or whatever. And, there's a silent auction, like you get the whole thing, but that's not human trafficking in your backyard. And so it doesn't start with kidnapping. It really starts with vulnerability. And they're looking for kids, male and female, who want to belong, who need that extra attention. And so be on the lookout. If the kid suddenly has a lot of money and you're thinking this is really odd, then go with your gut. Ask a question or two or three. Tell some people who runs away, who disappears for hours, who seems unusually attached to a weird adult. Why do they have 3 phones? I mean, as an educator, you're going to see some weird stuff. And if you've been in high school, you know I'm not lying. There are kids running around with 3 phones, and you're like, why in the world do you have 3 phones? You really got to wonder. Well, some of these are sex trafficking protocols, because this is the phone you use for XYZ. This is the phone that I'm going to call you on. Don't use this phone, and this one's not traceable, and this one is, and if I call, you better answer, and that's the other. So it's part of looking for red flags, and it's going to be exhausting, I think, as educators to have to always be on your toes, but it's one of the ways that we care for kids. Just be on the lookout for red flags because it's happening. And so I would encourage, as educators, just stay trained, stay current, know the hotlines. If there's training in your district to how to identify sex trafficking victims and sex trafficking in your community, take the training. Sometimes it's just a short video on child exploitation. Watch it. It may be disturbing, but I think you need to just be aware. Some of it's just awareness. But again, they're looking for vulnerability. And so that's really true about not just sex traffickers, but gangs, substance abuse, abusive relationships. I mean, these are all factors that a kid who's vulnerable can easily get tangled up in, an abusive boyfriend, girlfriend, because they're looking for that stability. So it really starts, I think, with just belonging. And once again, I drive home the need for a relationship. They just need a healthy place to belong because they're going to attach themselves to somebody and something. And if it's not healthy, then it's unhealthy.
You've talked about some red flags and some factors involved. This data, right, is ultimately what we're collecting. Truancy data, culture data.
Right.
Where's the students? Where are they sitting at lunch? Are they by themselves? Do they have 3 phones? Why do they have 3 phones? Collecting that outside data, looking in. And as researchers, we continually look forward. We are looking for ways to improve policy and practice. So what information or data do you believe Texas in general should be collecting or collecting differently, thinking maybe we are looking at this truancy data a little different to better understand and improve outcomes for children and families? What questions are the researchers or us not asking that we should be?
Is the kid connected? I think that's a huge question. Texas already does a good job of identifying students in foster care, and it's part of their PEMS data. So if you're looking for just hard numbers, who's in care, you'll find it. But that's not really the question that's going to help us care for kids. I think the more trauma-informed approach is not just who's in care, but who is connected. And so we're not really measuring the relationships. And so again, I would say we're getting good at measuring the services provided through their testing data and their benchmark scores. And of course, keeping an eye on their attendance rates, but relationships. Where is this kid connected? And I gotta, shout out to one of my principals when I was new into administration world. I was a new administrator. And I was working at a middle school, and my middle school principal, I don't know where he got the idea. For the sake of the story, I'll just credit it to him. I'm just going to say he was a genius, but the man had a huge heart for kids. And he had put up a list in the office. I think it was we called it the war room, but it was basically where all the testing data was housed. And he took all 3 walls available, and he listed every student in our roster. At that point, hundreds of kids we're talking about. You got hundreds of kids just on on paper copies of just roster after roster after roster. That's all it was. And he just taped them up alphabetically and by grade level. He had his organization. And what he asked the staff to do is to go through this pile he just got those little stickers that you see for garage sales, those little fluorescent round stickers. And he said, I'm going to have a bunch of these stickers in a basket. And I want you as an educator, as a assistant principal, as a counselor, as the nurse, everybody on our staff, take as many stickers as you need and just go put a sticker by every kid that you could say, I know that kid. I have a relationship with that kid. That kid knows me. Do you say good morning every day? Are they on your team? Do they eat lunch with you in your room? Are they a member of your choir? Like, if you're connected to that kid and you can say, oh yeah, that's my kid, then go put a sticker by that kid. And it was a daunting task. It got a little messy, but it was a very eye-opening experience to walk in the room and see a kid with 7 stickers, 12 stickers, because everybody loved that kid. They're like, everybody knows that kid. And then to realize there are kids with no stickers at all. And that was eye-opening, because somehow what we were learning is that there are kids who are going through our halls and sitting in our classrooms, and nobody really knows them. And so if you don't have that relationship, then how can you be proactive? How can you really provide them, not just the education that they need, but in the context of our conversation, be on the lookout for those red flags, for that safety net that we need to provide. So it was a great exercise in measuring relationship. I've never seen it done again, but it's something that has stuck with me for years. It was a beautiful visual, and it was a wonderful conversation to have with the staff to say, wow, look at what we do. Like, there are a lot of kids with great relationships, and I'm happy for those kids. So let's celebrate that. But let's really examine the fact that we've got a few kids without any stickers at all. And nobody in staff was able to say, yeah, that's my kid. And so what can we do better? And so I think that was a great opportunity for us to measure relationship. And those are the things that I think determine whether healing is going to take place in that school. Because again, healing starts with relationship.
So if you could recommend one policy or practice change that would have the greatest impact on improving outcomes for children involved in the child welfare system, what would it be?
Well, I think everybody can agree that prevention is always better than intervention. And so I would say we need to find as many ways as possible to invest upstream before a kid is in care. And that really starts with family preservation. And I alluded to this at the beginning of our time together, but my parents' ministry was basically family preservation before that was even a phrase coined. My dad did work with drug addicts and alcoholics. His ministry was rehabilitation, because ultimately that is what's, stealing the family's safety. If that alcoholic father becomes an abusive father, or loses their job, or decides to leave the family and spend all the money and choose alcohol, if that alcoholism gets to a point where it's costing the family, it's the kids who suffer. And so, by investing upstream, and the same I would say with the mothers in that situation, we're talking about family dynamic and trying to keep that family together. There are just as many, women who are dealing and struggling through those addictions. And so my father and my mother, when they were investing in their rehabilitation efforts to help moms and dads come off drugs, to come off alcohol, to get connected to Christ, to really turn their life around and become an active parent, it was investing upstream. And so I would say in that sense, we need to work to support families before they're in crisis. And it takes awareness, knowing how you can help that family. A family preservation center is one of the long-term goals that we have at the Children's Home of Lubbock, because, right now the work that we're doing is limited to our campus, but I would love to see us have a bigger footprint in the community with job training and with family counseling, with the clothes closet, with a food pantry, because when a family has to make hard decisions, they get desperate, then emotions run high, and that's when kids start to get hurt. If you're so stressed out about, what are you going to feed your kids, then, and you really are driven to desperation, then you're going to end up shoplifting something. If that act of desperation gets you arrested, well, then now your kids are in care. And so even a small thing like making sure that this family has food could really go a long way in keeping that mother or that father from making a desperate choice because of their limitations, And so it's things like that I that I feel like that works upstream. We're trying to take care of a problem before it becomes a crisis.
And what advice would you offer to all the educational stakeholders to make who would make a meaningful difference in the child of foster children?
Never underestimate the impact of one safe adult. You can be that adult. You can make a child feel seen and safe. And there's a lot of power in that. And so that one teacher, that one coach, that one counselor, that secretary, the bus driver, I mean, you could be that safe adult, and that kid can count on you for a smile. That kid can count on you for a snack. That kid can count on you in crisis. That's where you want to be. And so our kids who are involved in foster care, they have people who are, already on their team. I work with a lot of wonderful professionals who are supporting our kids in foster care. They have wonderful therapists and counselors. We have recreational therapy. We've got church volunteers. We got people in their corner all the time. But you can never have too many. And so every child is different. They're going to connect to somebody. And if it can be you, if it needs to be you, then just be available and be willing to be that one safe adult, because all it takes is one. The kid just needs to know they belong and know that they have a hope.
So looking ahead, what gives you the greatest hope for the future of child welfare? And what message would you like to leave with educators, child welfare professionals, policymakers, and families working together to support children?
I think for educators, again, we're talking about educators and education and foster care and being available. I think the hope that I see in education is the people who are still in education are there because they love what they're doing. I truly believe that. There's a lot of fantastic educators and administrators, and their heart is golden. I mean, they absolutely want to see the best for their kids, regardless of their background. And they're going to work hard to make that happen, despite the challenges. And they're willing. They're willing to look out for kids and to listen to their stories and to find ways to meet them where they are. And that's really important. So I do have a lot of hope for that, because it's the big and small things that make a difference. I can tell you that when I was an assistant principal, I had a kid who was really struggling in class, always falling asleep. And his teachers were always sending him to my office, and they were like, he's sleeping in class again. He's sleeping in class again. But there was I can honestly say there's probably only one teacher out of his entire schedule who really found that to be a discipline problem. The rest of them just found it to be annoying, and we're kind of wondering, why is this kid always falling asleep? And so one of his many trips to my office, again, for falling asleep, I was like, dude, what is going on with you, man? Like, you're always in here falling asleep. Like, pay attention, whatever. And he finally tells me, and he was like 16 years old, I think. And he says, Mr. Reyes, I live in a 2-bedroom house. And right now it's me, my mom, my brother, my little sister, my aunt, my granny, and then my uncle moved in. And he was like, and my grandma has 1 bedroom, and my mom and my sister have the other bedroom. And so me and my brother and my uncle all sleep in the living room, but my uncle doesn't have a job. And so he decides that he's going to play poker all night and smoke pot all night. And he's got his friends there. So every night, him and his friends come over after work, and they stay there till 2 and 3 in the morning in the living room. I can't sleep because they're up all night partying, and I got nowhere to sleep. They take the couch, and so I'm on the chair trying to lean back and sleep. I'm just tired. And he just started coming clean. He goes, I just want to sleep. That's all I want. Just leave me alone. I want to sleep. I said, okay. You want to take a nap? He was like, yeah. I said, okay. I said, well, I got lunch duty, so I'm going to let the secretary know you're here. you're welcome to lay down on the floor if that's where you want. He was like, I'm good in this chair. I said, okay. So I turned off the light. I left him in my office and I told the secretary, hey, just leave him alone for like 30 minutes. He just really needs to sleep. But there are story after story of educators. And, I'm not saying that because that was unique. I think there are a lot of educators who are going to do whatever they can to meet the needs of that child. And sometimes it's a snack. Sometimes it's a nap. Sometimes it's a pair of shoes. Sometimes it's a ride to school. But I have a lot of hope for the future because there are educators who are advocating for them day after day. And I realize that we're not going to solve every challenge, but we're aware. And I see a lot of people who are, stepping up to the plate, and that includes our foster parents. There might be a shortage of CASA workers, but I praise God for those who have stepped up to the plate. There might be a shortage of foster parents, but praise God for those who have showed up, because that is hope. We are not without, and we could always use more, but we're walking with these kids through some hard things, and it takes people with grit and heart and dedication. And so, but I see a lot about that. And those relationships, again, I can't emphasize that enough. Having a kid who knows that you see them is important. And they really want that. Our kids went to a summer camp just a few weeks ago, and they were only there about 4 days before I went up to visit them. And I went up to visit that summer camp, and in the evening, they had a small worship service. And the speaker said, at this time, if you're a staff member at the camp, I want you to be on the perimeter of the room, and we're just going to enjoy the presence of God for a minute. Campers, if you feel comfortable and you have a prayer request, or you just want to talk to somebody that you trust and you feel comfortable with, you're welcome to get up and go find an adult. Mind you, these are kids who are in foster care, and relationships are hard and trust is hard. And they'd only been at this camp for 4 days. And so I didn't really know how that was going to go. I was a little fearful that the adults were going to stand there by themselves. But lo and behold, the music starts playing, the kids start getting up, and one by one, they all start to go find an adult. And they're hugging on these counselors, and they're praying with them, and they're crying with them, and they're sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor, just talking. And it was beautiful to see that they are aching for that relationship. They're wanting to be seen and loved and belong, and they found it. Those are the moments that you realize that healing is possible and it's happening, but you have to answer the call. You got to step up, be available, and be the hands and feet of God.
All right, Dr. Reyes, thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. Your perspective reminds us that creating better outcomes for children and families requires strong partnerships among educators, child welfare professionals, policymakers, and community organizations. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of EduVoices, Championing Foster Futures. We hope today's conversation inspires new ideas and meaningful action as we work together to ensure that every child has the opportunity to thrive. Until next time, thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us on EduVoices, Champion Foster Futures. We hope today's episode sparked new insights and deepened your commitment to supporting foster youth. For updates, bonus content, and upcoming sessions, follow us on our social media outlets or visit our podcast page. But until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep advocating.